Sanbonani, good evening, Dumelang, and welcome to episode 146 of the Private Property Podcast. I'm your host, Zama Khumalo. It's a Tuesday edition of the Private Property Podcast, and welcome to any of our new viewers. If you're tuning in, whether from Facebook, YouTube, Instagram, or Twitter, welcome to the Private Property Podcast. We hope that you will be enjoying the future episodes that we're going to be having, including this one, and that you're going to go back and watch some of the old episodes we've had. We've got such a great variety of different episodes that we've covered over the past 145 episodes. You definitely want to make sure that you go back and catch up on some of the great content that we have in store for you. And talking of great content, something that we also have in store for you is the First Time Home Buyers Show. For all the first time home buyers who are always looking for different tips and tricks, and also looking at, wanting to find out more about what other first time home buyers went through during their first time home buying journey, then tune into the First Time Home Buyers Show with SC Clausen that comes to your screens every Wednesday evening just after this podcast at 7:45. And we never leave you there, because beyond houses and buildings and investing in property, we know that people are also interested in farming. And that's why we also have the farming podcast every Tuesdays and Thursdays at 1 p.m. That's another one that you definitely do not want to miss out. So always have a lot in store for you here on Private Property and across our various social media platforms. Do engage with us on Twitter, on Facebook, or YouTube. You can also follow my account on @zamantungwa_K, where we always tackle matters relating to property. Now, this evening we're looking at something that's slightly different from, a lot of the topics that we've covered in the past couple of months. And I know it's the first time that we're covering this one, and this is why I'm so excited about it, because it is the first time that we're talking about it to our viewers at home. And the topic this evening is tiny homes, the alternative property investment. Probably even wondering, what are tiny homes? That's exactly part of what we're going to be discussing this evening. What are tiny homes? How do we go about building it? Are there any rules pertaining to having a tiny home? Well, that's some of the things that we're going to be exploring this evening on the Private Property Podcast. And to help us better understand what exactly this thing is and what it entails, I'm joined this evening by Howard Dunbar, who's the owner of Custom Wood Designs. Howard, good evening, and thank you so much for joining us.
Pleasure. Good to be on your show.
Howard, before we even look at the technicalities when it comes to this one, what exactly is a tiny home? Because I'm sure people are thinking, okay, are you talking about just like a small, normal, compact house, maybe like a 2-bed house instead of a 5-bed house? What exactly is a tiny home?
It is generally considered to be always mobile. So it's on a trailer of some sort. So it must confine to the road regulations. So its maximum width is 2.5 meters and its maximum height is 4.3 meters. There isn't much limitation on the length other than what you're going to tow it with and where you're going to go. Some of them are single story, some of them are double story. They have a loft that you can squeeze in the 4.3 meters. But that's generally it. So it's narrower than what is in South Africa called a mobile home. It's bigger and got far more headroom than a caravan, and it's made more of materials that would be used in the wood building and home building industry than the caravan industry, which is a lot of plastics.
As you were talking, a part of me was thinking, okay, so is this essentially like a caravan that went to private school? Because you're already explaining it as though this is, the premium version really of a caravan.
I would say that's partially true. In the US, where this developed, the caravan that went to private school is called an RV, a recreational vehicle, and they get really big with a lot of facilities in them. The primary difference is that a caravan is designed to go very fast from Johannesburg, for instance, to the coast. So it's quite low, doesn't have much headroom, and it is always placed in a caravan park where you have ablution facilities, shower, toilets, and usually there's water and electricity points that you can plug into. Tiny homes must have their own. They're more self-sustainable. So you can go off into the middle of nowhere and you've got your water with you, you've got solar panels, you've usually got composting toilets.
And that probably actually brings me to what exactly goes into building, a tiny home. Because as you're explaining that it's essentially your home, but it's mobile and having things. I mean, a part of me is trying to imagine. I've seen it on, on TV or the various shows, especially in the US, where you'd have a shower and even a toilet. But now, of course, looking at it from a local perspective, it isn't something that we're particularly used to. I'm sure people are thinking, driving with your whole house everywhere. It probably has its perks. But what exactly does go into building a tiny house?
Okay, so in South Africa, we have a few differences to the US. In the US, you have very large buckies or pickup trucks, and your trailer is not limited in the weight that it can carry. Here in South Africa, we're only allowed to build trailers up to 3,000 kilograms towed by a normal pickup truck. Over that, it has to become an industrial trailer made by people who do bus bodies and trucks. And you need to tow it with a truck. So we have different regulations here, which are forcing the tiny house industry here to be smaller, which is more in line with where the tiny house industry started in the US. The US industry started as a reaction to people who had come out of university with a student loan and then be forced to buy a big house because legislation wouldn't allow you to build a small house. And so you had to take on this enormous bond with the bank. And so it was a reaction to that to try and find a way to avoid a bank loan. And so that doesn't make sense in the South African situation. Here you can build a small house if you want to. Many of the tiny houses in the US are now $1 million to 2 million rand in cost. And they look like little houses when you go inside, full of everything you could ever want appliance-wise. That doesn't make much financial sense in South Africa. Where it does make sense is the legislation on property in terms of building regulations, paying rates, where you can build. You can take a tiny house, and because it's a mobile structure, you can park it anywhere you like in your property, and you've effectively added another room or a granny flat or a cottage into your house without paying extra rates, and you've bypassed all of the regulations. So it has value there. It has value in a retreat where you can tow this thing into the middle of nowhere and have zero footprint, for instance, in a nature reserve where you're not allowed to build. And there it would be perfect because there you can go in and you have all your facilities that you need, and you're not building or making a footprint. So there are some unique situations in South Africa where it does have value. A number of Airbnbs have bought them from me where they've just added them on as extra bedrooms with a sort of a sitting area. Some farms come retreats have bought them. People have bought them as retreat spaces and even as art studios to put them out in the middle of nowhere where they can go away for weekends and they've got this cabin, this tiny house where all the facilities are there. And it's far more comfortable and spacious than a caravan. The only downside compared to the caravan is that towing wise, you're probably towing more at 80 kilometers an hour than 120 kilometers an hour. So it takes a little longer to get there because they're higher. They don't have pop top roofs normally. They're fairly spacious.
We've got a comment here coming in from Facebook to our viewers on Facebook and across our various social media platforms. Have you even heard of tiny homes? Is this something that you would consider, living in, or perhaps even as an investment? And later on in the conversation, I actually wanted to look a little bit about it being an investment, option. Already, Howard touched on the different ways that some of his clients have used it, when it comes to whether, having an Airbnb and adding that onto the property. So you want to have more essentially beds that the Airbnb offers, and you're able to rent out more rooms in your particular property, or end up having a cottage in the property that you have. So those are already different ways that people are using those tiny homes. One of our regular viewers, Martha Shingange, says, oh, so there's a difference between tiny homes and mini homes. Would you say that there is that difference between the two, Howard?
No, it's gone the other way. The tiny homes were started by a guy called Jeff Schaefer in the US, and they were normally about 15, 16, 18 feet. But the US being what it is, it's just gone bigger and bigger and bigger and bigger. And now they need special trucks and special licenses to pull them around because they're so wide, so big, so high, whatever. So the word tiny houses in the US, the tiny houses aren't tiny anymore. So that sort of answers the question. Yeah. I only do tiny houses. So the biggest I've built has been about 6.5 meters long. Yeah.
How many square meters would you say that was, Howard?
Well, that would be basically 2.5 by 6. So 6 is 12, about 15 square meters. So it's really small. And in many of them, it's really one big open space with the exception of the bathroom. So it would be a bedroom that leads into a living area where there would be a dinette come couch come general sort of living area, and then a kitchen, and then a separate bathroom with a hot and cold running water, a shower, and a composting toilet. But it really is about simple living. It's more minimalist living. And they're becoming increasingly popular with land being a problem. As more and more people are struggling to afford land, the idea of living in community where a piece of land is acquired and then you all have your tiny house and you live in an allocated space, and then you work together in, for instance, growing a big vegetable garden so that you have some security, food security. And let's say you have internet at the same time, so you're able to be a digital nomad running your business by internet whilst living in a tiny house within this community. This is becoming a very popular idea in South Africa. I've made 18 and many of them recently are going into community spaces.
And Howard, one of the things that I've picked up, not so much here in South Africa, but in the US is, and we already have a system like that. I mean, if you even look at, for example, the caravan community where there's a caravan park and you have that allocated space, and it's something that's quite big, right? I mean, there's certain property investors who only deal with, the caravan sort of market when they look at their, what's in their books. So that is something that I think we might probably, increasingly look forward to here in South Africa, because it is a trend, like you're saying, that's slowly picking up. And I think if you're considering going minimalist, that's probably a space. I know I could probably do that as a, if you book out an Airbnb and you look for it as an adventure and an experience, perhaps as opposed to doing it on a regular basis. Howard, we're going to go for a quick break, and when we come back, we'll be taking more questions and comments from our viewers at home. I also want us to probably, and you've touched on this, probably look at the legalities of this tiny home, especially if you don't have your own property to essentially put that home in. So you want to be fully mobile. Where are people going to be almost parking their various houses, when they start living in them? We'll be exploring that, and of course, your questions and comments at home. We'll be back just after this. Welcome back to the Private Property Podcast. I'm your host, Zama Khumalo. If you've just joined us, well, you're listening to a very interesting conversation about something that we haven't spoken about before. We're looking at tiny homes, the alternative property investment, looking at what exactly is a tiny home, how you can go about building it here in South Africa, and the different opportunities that tiny homes present. And I'm joined by Howard Dunbar, who's the owner of Custom Wood Designs. We are taking your questions and comments at home, whether you are watching us on Facebook, on Instagram, or YouTube. Do send them through. Perhaps you've once explored wanting to get a tiny home, or you're still a bit, not convinced. Maybe it's a bit too small, but you're thinking this could be an interesting way for you to add that extra cottage in your property without having to, go through many hoops of building one from the ground up. Howard, we've got a question here from Usemi Mahatse on Facebook asking, can the bank approve the bond application for this tiny home? And I think before we even get to the bond application, perhaps let's talk about, the costing of building tiny homes. Typically what kind of figures are people looking for? Because I think before we even look at whether this is something that can get bonded or you'd have to sort of use your own funds, I'm sure people are interested if they want to have an extra cottage, because one of the big things we encourage our viewers at home is you want to run your numbers. So when you're thinking of even adding that extra bedroom or 2 bedrooms in your home, or building townhouses just behind your house, it's so crucial for you to be able to run your numbers. So what kind of figures are we typically looking at? I mean, I know it's not a one size fits all. You've already said they come in different sizes, but typically what kind of figures would one be looking at if they wanted to get a tiny house?
Yeah, so the smaller tiny houses that I build are around 130 to 140,000 rand, and they go up to about 200,000 rand. That would be a 6-meter plus with a separate bathroom, everything that you would need to live off grid in terms of solar panels, batteries, pumps. It would be a comfortable space if you're comfortable living in a sort of a minimalist life. Yeah. So far, it's a very new idea in South Africa, and the banks will not bond one. They're considered more a caravan, and so you would need to take out a hire purchase agreement or something like that, or just get a straight loan from the bank to buy it.
We've got a question from Khonse857 here on Instagram who asks, are the rules and regulations the same with containers? So if you wanted to have a container, perhaps it's not mobile, but you want to probably put it in your home. We've seen some homemakers putting that extra container and really jazzing it up. I mean, there have been some great innovations with containers. Would you say that it's relatively the same, Howard?
Fairly similar. The only difference is that in some suburbs, the building inspector will expect you to move the container once the building has finished, because normally the containers are brought in as site officers or to assist when a site is being built. And so it depends on your building inspector in the area. They can ask you to move it. So in other words, if you're saying, well, it's temporary and it's mobile, they'll say, okay, move it from that side to that side. And then that's very difficult to do. With a tiny house on wheels, it's very simple to do. So containers are not really that mobile, especially if you suddenly anchor it into the ground, add in electricity and plumbing. And that's the problem that the building inspector has. As soon as you add plumbing, it's considered a permanent dwelling.
And I hope, Khonse, that it answers that question. We have seen this happen in quite a lot of different suburbs. So you probably just need to find out how your area is and whether they allow for something like that. I've seen great ones in different suburbs where, you know, sometimes it's just part of the architecture of the house. Sometimes, you know, certain aspects of the house that have, you know, that feel, or where they've made use of it. And, you know, Howard, I was saying earlier that perhaps when we look at then the legalities, and you've already touched on this one because you've mentioned how, you know, one of the early examples that you're able to use this, probably put it in your yard at home. But one of the other realities is perhaps you don't currently, let's say you don't have your own yard to put it in, and you want to be able to buy it. You're thinking, look, it's probably going to be cheaper for me to buy this, then I'll essentially own a home than trying to go buy a house for, you know, R1 million or more. What are some of the, we'll say, regulations or legalities of just almost having it and being able to drive around everywhere, owning this home, this mobile home, essentially?
Well, the only problem is where you're going to park it. And so if you park overnight in a lay-by or something like that, that's not illegal. But if you stay, then it does become illegal, and the traffic police will come and ask you to move on. There is a good investment opportunity in land for someone to find a decent piece of land, probably with a good view or relatively protected, and add the facilities of water and electricity, because nearly every person who comes to buy a tiny house from me is looking for a place to park it. So, for instance, there are a number of overseas clients who come to me and they want to, the first problem they have is where they're going to park it when they're back over in Germany, for instance. So there is definitely a market for creating a place to park tiny homes, or for people to live in tiny homes. And it would work well, I think, for a developer, because he doesn't have to develop the housing infrastructure and roads and whatever it is. He could have a fairly wild piece of land, and it may not even have to bring in electricity, because they could all be off-grid with solar panels. All they would require is water. Yeah.
We've got another question here. One of our viewers who's just joined us, TK Nguma, who's joined us on Instagram, saying, I just joined now. What size are these tiny homes?
So the normal restriction, if you're going to tow it on the road, is 2.5 meters wide and 4.3 meters high maximum. And you can go up to about 8-10 meters without any problems in length.
And
the biggest problem you're presented with is the weight. As it gets heavier, you need to get different types of trailers. And as soon as you go over 750 kilograms, you have to have a special license. As soon as you go over 3,000 kilograms, you have to have a special vehicle to tow it.
Howard, we've got a request here from one of our regular viewers, Sammy Mahlatsa, coming back saying, on this tiny homes, can we please see pictures, Zama? We need to start having presentations. So I'm going to request for Howard to just send us a few images that we're able to share, because I think people are almost struggling to imagine, you know, a full home that is mobile. Because as we were saying, Howard, for many of us probably in South Africa, it is a new concept. We know of caravans, but this isn't a caravan. So a part of you is trying to imagine how would that, you know, physically look like. So we'll ask Howard to send us through some of the images that we'll also share down here below.
But I would also suggest, I mean, if you go onto YouTube and put in tiny home or tiny house, you will be inundated with pictures and videos. There is enormous interest in it worldwide. It has a big following in Australia, Canada, US, obviously, where it started, and Europe.
And perhaps, you know, Howard, before we end off our conversation, let's look at it, and you touched on this earlier on in our conversation, but let's look at it in terms of it being an investment alternative for viewers at home. I mean, we speak a lot about sort of bricks and mortar and buying that property, perhaps renting it out. And this is now an interesting and a different way of still playing in the property space, but doing it very differently and also doing it at quite a minimal cost. Because I mean, if you look at the cost of, people coming to you and asking you to build one of these tiny homes versus buying one with relatively similar specs, but obviously not the same size, you'll find that somebody's probably going to be paying 4 or 5 times more. When you look at how it could potentially be an investment, vehicle, how have you found your different clients essentially using it? You've mentioned earlier, different people, for example, using it as Airbnb. What are the other creative ways that you've seen people using it for investment purposes?
Well, I have one client who is a engineer who is often having to consult in the Transkei, and she couldn't find any decent Airbnb accommodation. She didn't like having to hop from one place to another. So she had me made one for her. She parked it in Coffee Bay, and every weekend she spent in Coffee Bay, which is a beautiful seaside resort. It's worked very well for her. And the amount of money she would have spent on Airbnb, she's recouped that within a very short period of time. In other words, she's paid off the caravan with what she would normally pay on Airbnb. So that made sense for her. I've got a retreat in Montague that have cabins to rent, and they have bought 2 now gypsy wagons. The first one paid for itself within 1 year. They had such a good income stream. It's on Route 69. It worked so well, they ordered a second, which they received in about, I think, sometime early this year. And they're already looking at a third. So it's a good investment from an Airbnb point of view because it's unique. It's special. You can put it in situations that maximizes view. You can move it. I have clients here that like one area, one part of the year, and another area of our farm, another part of the year. So you're flexible. It's also great from a point of view of just thinking of COVID. If you're stuck in an area where you want to move and the housing value is going down, if you've got a tiny house, you can move your tiny house. You become far more mobile and flexible in challenging situations.
And I cannot let you go, Howard, before asking you around maintenance. We are very familiar with how to maintain, whether it's an apartment or a house, what goes into maintaining a tiny home.
Okay, so maintenance of tiny homes is normally a little bit more than a house. Because most of them are built quite lightly, so that they can travel easily and be moved easier. So a lot of them usually have quite a lot of wood, and wood requires annual maintenance. Some are made with a sort of a tin corrugated type IBR covering. That makes them more bulletproof, and they require very little maintenance. But most tiny houses require a little bit more maintenance because they're mobile. They're not bricks and mortar. So that would probably be one of the major disadvantages. You just have to look after them. They're a little bit more fragile because they can move. As concrete and bricks doesn't move unless you have a tornado.
And Howard, as we wrap up, any last bit of advice for viewers at home who are, perhaps exploring building a tiny home? Any words of wisdom you'd like to share with them as they embark on that journey?
Probably the best thing is to go on YouTube. There is an enormous amount of information and examples of tiny houses. And so you'll see if it's something you're interested in, you'll see what's available, and you'll start to get an idea of what it costs and what you can do with it, because they explore regulations, limitations, advantages, disadvantages, all of the topics.
Well, Howard, we're going to leave it there. I do hope, Sammy, that you're happy with that one. Going on Facebook, trying to find, certainly looking at the different options that are there. I think some of them are quite intriguing. And when you see a lot of the examples from the US, as Howard said, they keep getting bigger and bigger and bigger. And those, of course, are interesting. We know how the US typically does. Everything is bigger that side of the world. So I don't think anything ever stays tiny that side of the equator. But Howard, we're going to leave it there this evening. Thank you so much for joining us.
Absolute pleasure.
And that is Howard Dunbar, who is the owner of Custom Wood Designs. I do hope that you've enjoyed that one. It's very different from what you typically, look at. But I think as we diversify the different kinds of things that we're able to do with property, whether you're looking at, renting out your apartment or a part of the apartment, or perhaps exploring something that's similar to Airbnb, it's always great to know what the different options are out there and whether or not you'd be interested in them. And one of the great things I like about this one is that the cost is relatively low. And if you're able to find creative ways or creative places to put it, you probably might be able to make a little bit of money for yourself on the side. Well, that's it from me, Zama and the rest of the Private Property Podcast team. It has been a pleasure to be with you. We're back on your screens tomorrow at 7 p.m. It is ABSA Home Loans Wednesday. So that's something that you can certainly look forward to. We're looking forward to being with you. Of course, stay tuned to our social media platforms where we'll also be asking you great questions on some of the topics that you want us to cover. Until tomorrow, hoping you're staying home and staying safe.
Hi, I'm Nicoline Terblanche and I'm part of the SA Women's Hockey team. And I'm the technical director of Tax Hockey. And I'm also the assistant coach for the first team ladies. I moved to Ferry Glen about 5 years ago. Ferry Glen is a really safe place and the people are really kind. Some of my friends live really close by in suburbs like Equestria and Olympus. In the morning I will wake up, make myself a cup of coffee, go for a jog in the Ferry Glen Nature Reserve or even just in the neighborhood. It's safe, quiet, and the environment is really nice. I love Ferry Glen because I'm near the city, but I'm not in the city. like to go to Pretoria Country Club to clear my mind, on my own, to relax and just to enjoy a round of golf. In Pretoria East, we really have nice places to visit, like Mainland Mall and Brooklyn Mall, that is really close by. There are also a lot of top schools in the area, like Pretoria Boys High and Hoërskool Menlo Park. One of the most beautiful places to see the whole of Pretoria is the Fort Kapperkop viewpoint. And that's my neighborhood.